The scratching started just after midnight. Margaret Hale heard it first as something inside a dream, a low, rhythmic scrape against painted wood. And then she was awake, sitting upright in the dark, listening to it come from the front door of her farmhouse in the specific way that tells a person this is real and not dreamed. It was February. 12 degrees outside. Nobody knocked on doors off Route 7 outside Sheridan, Wyoming at this hour without a reason worth fearing. Margaret was 67 years old and had been alone in this house for 14 months, and she had learned the sounds the cold made when it was just the cold, and the sounds the farm made when something on it was not right. She put on her robe. She found the flashlight on the nightstand before she turned on any lights, the way she'd learned to do since Tom died, and she walked down the dark hallway to the front door and looked through the small window she'd had installed in it the previous spring for exactly this kind of moment. What she saw was not a man. It was a dog, a German shepherd, enormous, dark, motionless in the wind, sitting on her porch as though it had always intended to be there. Its ears were forward. Its eyes caught the beam of her flashlight and held it steadily. It did not bark. It did not flinch. It simply waited, the way something waits when it has already made a decision and is giving you time to make yours. Margaret opened the door. The dog was in worse condition than it had looked through glass. Its ribs were visible under the coat, which was caked with burrs and dried mud along its flanks. One of its front paws had a shallow cut across the pad, already clotted, but the cold would keep the bleeding down only so long. It was not shaking, which worried her more than shaking would have. Animals stop shaking when they have gone past the point where shaking can help. But its eyes were clear and steady, and they held her gaze with the particular focused calm of something that had not lost its mind, despite everything that had happened to bring it here. She reached for its collar. And then she stopped. The tag was not a pet tag. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. What that tag revealed, and what it set in motion, will change how you think about the promises we make and the ones we leave behind. We read every single comment, and we are grateful for every one of you. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Reeves had left Fort Bragg on a medical transport 7 months before the dog appeared on Margaret Hale's porch. And he had not left willingly. He was 38 years old when the Army finally put the paperwork through, and 39 by the time the nerve damage in his lower back had progressed enough that physical therapy had stopped producing meaningful results, and his commanding officer had sat across from him in an office in Fayetteville and used the word permanent in a sentence about Cole's service career. Cole had listened without expression, the way he'd been trained to receive information that could not be changed by arguing with it, and he had thanked the man. And he had driven 3 hours north on I-95 before he stopped at a gas station outside Roanoke and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes without getting out of the truck. He was a compact, hard-built man, 5'11" and 210 pounds in the way that comes from actual use rather than deliberate construction, with close-cropped dark brown hair and a square jaw that tended to be set even in stillness. His eyes were the color of old denim, pale blue-gray, that most people found difficult to hold for long, not because they were cold, but because they were too attentive. The eyes of a man who had learned to watch everything in a room simultaneously and had never been able to set that habit down. His left hand carried a scar across the knuckles from a night in Kandahar that he described, when he described it at all, as a hand tool mishap. He had done 2 deployments with the 3rd Special Forces Group, Kandahar Province and the Kunar Valley, and a 3rd partial deployment with a joint task force in Syria, 8 months, for which his official record reflected only the dates. He came home intact in the ways that didn't show on scans, and then the back started. Slow, and then conclusive. The Army processed him out with a medical retirement and a handshake and a parking lot in Roanoke where he sat for 40 minutes before making the only decision that made sense. He went home. Home was a 200-acre cattle operation outside Sheridan that had belonged to his father and his father's father, and that Cole had not seen in more than 4 years. He arrived in October to a house and fences that both needed work, and a bank account that reflected the pension and nothing else. He started with the fences, because fence work produced a visible result at the end of each day, and visible results were what he needed. He was not happy exactly. He was occupied. For a man like Cole Reeves, occupied was a reasonable start. Ghost had been his for 3 years before the medical discharge came through. The dog was a 6-year-old German Shepherd with a coat the color of midnight along his back and saddle, lightening to deep amber at the chest and legs, the kind of coloring that reads as pure authority in direct light and as something almost invisible in shadow, which had made him useful in ways that Cole still didn't discuss in detail. He weighed 84 pounds of precise, controlled power and moved with the unhurried efficiency of a dog who had learned that speed without purpose was wasted. His right ear had a small triangular notch in the outer edge where a fragment had caught it during a vehicle breach in Kandahar, and the scar had healed clean and flat, and Ghost had never seemed to notice it. He had a titanium crown on his upper left canine from a dental repair done at Bagram in 2022, and when he yawned you could see it catch the light. His eyes were amber, the kind of amber that looks lit from inside, steady and evaluating, moving from face to face in a room the way a sweep moves across terrain. Ghost had been through more with Cole than Cole had been through with most people, and that was not an exaggeration. Trained to detect explosives, to track, to apprehend, and to do 3 other things Cole had signed documents agreeing never to discuss, all of it performed under circumstances that would have broken a lesser animal. When Cole had fought the Mendubly adoption paperwork for 6 months, it had not been sentiment. It had been the recognition that Ghost was the only living thing in Cole's life that required no explanation and offered no judgment, and that this was worth fighting for. Ghost moved with Cole through the Sheridan property like a partner walking familiar ground. He checked fence lines. He settled at Cole's feet in the evenings. He slept outside Cole's bedroom door and was at the foot of the bed by morning. The neighbors described the dog as well-behaved, which was the wrong word entirely. Ghost was not well-behaved. He was disciplined. And the difference was the difference between a man who followed rules and a man who had understood why the rules existed and made them his own. Sheridan in February was its own kind of country. The Bighorn Mountains sat to the west, on clear days a white wall, on other days just a pressure you could feel. The cold that came down from them was not the clean, dry cold of the high plains, but something heavier, the kind that settled into valleys and stayed. The ranch was 6 miles north of town on a road the county plowed irregularly. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure Cole's grandfather had built in 1958. Solid, but with a furnace Cole had replaced in November and windows that needed work by spring. At night the wind moved through the valley in long notes that were more felt than heard, and the silence between gusts was the kind that makes a man aware of how large alone actually is. Margaret Hale's property was the next farm north. She had lived there for 31 years with her husband Tom, who had been a Navy corpsman in Vietnam and a cattle rancher for every year after that, and who had died of a cardiac event 14 months ago in the kitchen of the farmhouse where he had cooked breakfast every morning of his retirement. Tom Hale had been 69 years old and healthy by every measure his last physical had produced, and his heart had simply stopped on a Tuesday morning in December while the coffee was still brewing, and Margaret had found him when she came downstairs. She had stayed. There was nowhere else she was going to go. The collar tag that Margaret Hale read by flashlight on her front porch at 12:20 in the morning was not a civilian dog tag. It was a stamped military identification tag, the kind issued to military working dogs, and it read, Ghost MWDK-9, United States Army Handler, SSG Cole Reeves Unit. 3RD SFG. Below the unit designation, someone had added a second tag on the same ring. Civilian. Handwritten on a small aluminum plate in the careful printing of someone who wanted the words to last. It read, if found, this dog knows the way home. He just needs someone to open the door. C.R. Margaret stood in the open doorway for a long moment in the 12-degree dark, with the wind pulling at her robe and a military working dog looking up at her from her porch, and she made the only decision she could. She stepped back and held the door open. Ghost walked inside. She didn't know yet that Cole Reeves had been missing for 36 hours. She found out the next morning when she called the number she'd found through the county property records for the Reeves Ranch to the south, and a man named Deputy Aaron Greer answered on the third ring and told her that they had been looking for Cole Reeves since the previous morning, when Cole's ranch hand, a retired Army sergeant named Diaz, who came 3 days a week, had arrived to find the truck gone, the front door unlocked, the coffee maker on, and Ghost missing. The dog is here, Margaret said. Deputy Greer was at her door in 22 minutes. Ghost would not get into Greer's vehicle. He stood in Margaret's front yard with his nose working and his eyes fixed south-southwest, toward the field that backed onto the Reeves property line, and when Greer opened the rear door of the patrol unit, Ghost looked at it, looked at Greer, then looked south-southwest again in the deliberate, repeating way of a dog communicating something it considers obvious. He knows where Cole is, Margaret said. Greer called for a second unit and told Margaret to stay inside. Ghost led them across the field at the property line and through a stand of cottonwoods along the frozen creek bed and up a gradual rise to a place where the terrain flattened into a shelf of land with a clear view of the valley floor below. Cole was there. He had been there for somewhere between 20 and 28 hours, based on what the paramedics later calculated, in a shallow draw on the south-facing slope, where he had gone down when the back spasm had seized through him, without warning during what had started as a routine fence check. He had gone down hard in the snow and been unable to get upright again, and had eventually stopped trying, the way you stop trying things that aren't working and apply your energy to things that might. He had used his jacket to keep his core temperature as contained as possible. He had eaten the 2 protein bars in his coat pocket. He had done everything right, which was why he was still alive. Ghost was lying across Cole's legs when Greer and the second deputy crested the rise. The dog had not been there when Cole went down. Cole had been alone when the spasm hit, and Ghost had been at the house. But Ghost had gone looking and found, and then made the calculation that 36 hours in the February cold of the Bighorn foothills required warmth more than it required searching for additional help. He had lain across his handler's legs through the night. Cole's core temperature when the paramedics reached him was low, but survivable. The paramedics wanted to move Cole immediately. Ghost stood up and placed himself at Cole's shoulder with his body angled across the path and his eyes communicating, again, something that required no translation. Cole put one hand on the dog's neck and said one word, easy, and Ghost stepped aside and remained close while they worked. Cole was conscious. He was in significant pain. He looked up at Deputy Greer with the particular expression of a man who has had a long night to take stock of his situation and has reached a conclusion about something. "My neighbor," he said. "Margaret Hale. Is she the one who found him?" "She is," Greer said. Cole absorbed this. "I need to thank her," he said. Properly, he said it the way men say things they mean as operational directives, not social formalities, and Greer nodded the way men nod when they understand the difference. What Cole Reeves did not know yet, what no one outside a specific circle of people in Sheridan knew, and what Margaret had not told Greer or the paramedics or anyone in the 14 months since Tom died, was the thing that Tom Hale had left behind. Not a secret exactly. More a debt that Tom had carried quietly for 53 years, from a river valley in South Vietnam in 1971, and that had never been repaid because he'd never been sure how to repay it, and then he had died with the coffee still brewing. It took 3 weeks after Cole's rescue for the story to come fully into the light. Cole was released from Sheridan Memorial Hospital after 2 days. The hypothermia had been treated. The back scans confirmed what he already knew: the stenosis was progressing, and Wyoming winters would require adjustment, and adjustment did not mean leaving. He went home with a referral to a specialist in Billings and a dog who no longer slept outside his bedroom door but across the foot of his bed, which Cole had decided was appropriate. Margaret brought food. She did not announce this or negotiate it. She appeared at the door on the 3rd day with a covered dish and the direct manner of a woman who knew that food was how you entered a grief someone wasn't ready to name yet, and Cole let her in. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Ghost lay between them on the floor, and Margaret said that there was something she needed to tell him about his father. Cole Reeves had not known that his father and Tom Hale had ever met. He'd known the Reeves and Hale properties had been neighbors for decades. He'd known his father had respected Tom Hale. What he had not known, what Tom had told Margaret in confidence, and what Margaret had carried for 3 decades, was the August night in 1995 when Cole's father, Walter, had driven his truck into the Tongue River on Route 14 at 2 in the morning, and Tom Hale had been the one driving behind him. Tom had pulled Walter out of the shallow water before any patrol unit arrived. He had driven Walter home and said nothing. To no one, ever. Not the sheriff, not their wives, not Margaret, until years later. Walter had gotten sober 90 days after that night. He had never relapsed. He and Tom had maintained a friendship for the remaining 20 years of Walter's life that was warmer and more deliberate than either of them would have explained to anyone who asked. Walter died in 2018. Tom died 14 months ago. Tom had left a letter. Margaret had been waiting for the right person to give it to. The letter was 3 handwritten pages addressed to Walter Reeves, beginning with the words, "I've been meaning to say this for 30 years, and I've run out of reasons not to." It said what Tom had never said aloud, that he hadn't pulled Walter out of the Tongue River to collect a debt. He'd done it because he'd come back from Vietnam knowing what it looked like when a man was drowning, and the water was only one of the things he was drowning in. And he'd made a private decision on a fire base in Quang Tri Province that if he ever saw that look again and had the ability to act, he would act. He'd seen it in Walter Reeves's eyes in the beam of his headlights that August night. He'd done what he'd promised himself he would do. The letter ended with 1 paragraph that Tom had written, Margaret told Cole, in the final week of his life, when he'd known the heart wasn't cooperating the way it should. "The debt runs the other direction," the last paragraph read. "What I got from that night was the certainty that the thing I promised myself in Vietnam was worth promising. That is worth more than I can tell you. I hope your boy comes home and finds something worth staying for." Cole read the letter at the kitchen table with Ghost lying across his feet and Margaret sitting across from him with her coffee and the particular stillness of a woman who knows she is delivering something that needed to arrive and is giving it the room it deserves. He read it twice. He set it down on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the Bighorn Peaks, white and clear in the February morning light. "He never told me any of this," Cole said. "No," Margaret said. "He told my Tom. And Tom told me. and I've been waiting to tell the right person." Ghost pressed his head against Cole's knee and held it there. It was not the kind of debt anyone could repay. It was not meant to be repaid. That was what Tom Hale had been trying to say in 3 handwritten pages to a dead man's son, and Cole Reeves understood it the way soldiers understand things, not all at once, but in the body first, and in the mind later, slowly, on its own schedule. In the months that followed, several things became clear, and then became permanent. Margaret Hale stayed on the farm. She had never been leaving, but in March she agreed to let Cole reinforce the fence line between the properties, not as a separation, but as a joint project, which is a different thing. And the work took 3 weekends and produced results that both of them could see from their respective windows. Cole's physical therapist in Billings put him on a structured program for the stenosis that was not a cure, but was a management strategy. And Cole applied himself to it with the same systematic patience he had applied to field operations and paperwork and fence lines, because that was the only way he knew how to do things. The back was not going to be what it was. He was learning to build a life around what it was going to be instead. Ghost became, by unspoken consensus, a dog who belonged to both properties. He spent nights in Cole's house and mornings in Margaret's kitchen, where a specific brand of treat had appeared on the counter, and stayed there. On Sunday mornings, Cole brought coffee to Margaret's porch, and they sat with the mountains behind them and Ghost between their chairs, and they talked about Tom Hale and Walter Reeves, and a night on Route 14 in 1995, and about what it meant to carry something for 50 years, because you weren't sure the world was ready for it yet. The man who had triggered the crisis, the reason Cole had been checking that particular fence line in the worst cold of the year, was a property developer named Richard Caldwell, a Cheyenne businessman who had been putting systematic legal pressure on both the Reeves Ranch and the Hale property for 11 months through nuisance claims and water rights challenges. He had identified the adjacent properties as a single development opportunity and calculated, correctly, that a recently discharged veteran with a spinal injury and a widow in her late 60s represented favorable negotiating conditions. He had retained a local firm whose senior partner sat on 2 county boards. He had filed 4 challenges in 14 months. He had told 2 people at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast in January that both properties would be in different hands by fall. He had not accounted for Tom Hale's letter. The letter, as Cole's attorney, a former JAG officer named Renata Foss, found through a veterans legal assistance network in Casper, explained to Caldwell's firm in a certified letter in April, was not itself a legal instrument. What it documented was the beginning of a 30-year relationship between neighboring landowners that had produced informal agreements about water access and grazing rights that Caldwell's claims had directly violated. That documented community history made the nuisance claims collapse under discovery. Caldwell's attorneys withdrew 3 of 4 pending challenges in May. The 4th was dismissed by the circuit court in June. Richard Caldwell sold his Sheridan County development interests to a different firm by August and was not seen in the area again. By the following October, the Reeves Ranch had a new water heater, repaired fencing on the north and east sides, and a generator Cole had rebuilt from salvage over 3 weekends, with Ghost sleeping in the garage. Margaret's farmhouse had new weather stripping on every exterior door and window, installed by Cole in September, and a furnace the technician had signed off on as ready for whatever the Bighorns sent. Cole's back was not fixed. It was managed. Most days he worked. Some days he did not. And on those days he did not pretend otherwise. On a Saturday in October, cool and clear with the first snow on the peaks, Cole sat on Margaret's porch with a cup of coffee and Tom Hale's letter in his jacket pocket, where he had been carrying it since April. Ghost was out in the field between the 2 properties doing what he did when no one required anything of him, moving through the tall grass with his nose working and his amber eyes lit with the uncomplicated joy of an animal that has enough space and the certainty that his handler is within range. He flushed a pheasant and chased it for 30 yards, ears flat, barking once with pure delight. He did not catch it. He turned back toward the porch and sat in the grass below the steps and looked up at Cole with the expression of a dog who has decided this is the exact right place to be. Cole looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," Cole said. "Me too." Sometimes the most important door that gets opened in a life is not a decision anyone makes in daylight with a clear plan. Sometimes it is opened in the dark, at midnight, in the cold. Because a dog is scratching at it, and something in you says this animal has already made its own decision and deserves the same from you. God does not always send rescue with sirens or daylight. Sometimes he sends it through an animal who crossed 2 frozen fields because he remembered that his handler needed to be found. Sometimes he sends it through a letter written by a dead man who understood what it means to pull someone out of the water, not for what you'll be owed, but for what you'll know about yourself afterward. The faithfulness in this story is not only the dog's. It runs through 30 years and 2 generations and a coffee still brewing when one of the men who carried it finally set it down. What it asks of us is simpler than it sounds, and harder than it sounds. Pay attention. Open the door. Do not drive past. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness doesn't expire, and that the faithfulness of the people around us often travels further than we know. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever had a door open at the right moment, or been the one to open it, we'd love to hear that too. Your story might be the one that reaches someone who needs it tonight. If you believe in stories of loyalty, service, and the quiet ways that grace moves through ordinary lives, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you always, no one who pays attention and chooses to act is ever wasting their time.